Hello, everybody. Welcome to topic 4 in marine ecology, which is ecology of life histories. We're still in the organism module, of course, and asking the question, why are organisms the way they are? How can we interpret organisms as a collection of adaptations to their present and past environments? How can we interpret organisms as products of natural selection? And maybe we should also include sexual selection, kin selection. Up until now, we've been talking primarily about components of reproduction. So, sex, mating, caring for young, cooperative behavior among family members and social groups. So, now, from now on, we assume that the organism is capable of mating and reproducing using whatever strategy that has maximized its ability to pass on its genes to future generations. And the next question we're asking is, how is reproduction integrated into the rest of the life cycle of the organism? And how is that a response to the environment? Obviously, reproduction is not the only component of fitness. So we ask this question again in the context of natural selection and adaptation. And the way that reproduction is integrated in the rest of the life cycle is usually in terms of resource use, resource economy. And we assume that there's a total amount of resource in the environment that's limited, and the organism has to make a choice how it decides to use that resource. Some of the resource is going to be used as reproduction. Some will be used for everything else. And everything else is just the umbrella term maintenance. There's maintenance of your body, your function, which includes survival from day to day. Right, if you go to a natural history museum, most museums will display pretty much only specimens of mature adult plants and animals, as if adults were the only organisms in nature. But obviously, the organism is not just an adult, it's its entire life cycle. We are or were at one time eggs and sperm. We were at one time a differentiating embryo. We were children, adolescents, young adults, maybe reproducing adults. And if we're lucky, someday we will be senescing adults. Some of us already are. So you can say that we are all of those things. And natural selection or kin selection or sexual selection can act on all of these stages. And each stage has different demands, but they all interact with each other. And we can ask, how has natural selection produced an integrated whole organism? That integrated whole is the life history pattern, the life history of the organism. And we can ask, why has natural selection resulted in different life history patterns in different species, even different closely related species? Why are some species of algae short-lived and ephemeral? Other species longer lived, some perennial, larger size, such as these kelp beds? Why do some species produce millions of tiny offspring while others produce just a few very large? Why do some birds lay only one egg, albatrosses for example, while others lay several, for example cormorants? Why is it that organisms with a long lifespan tend to reach reproductive maturity when much older than organisms with a short lifespan, even though they are physiologically capable of maturing earlier? In mammals, for example, the age of maturity is about 75% of the average lifespan. Um, in birds, the age of maturity is about 35% the average lifespan. In fish, the age of maturity is actually twice the average lifespan, since you're more likely to die before you're sexually reproductively mature. So why is there these differences in different groups? So there are basically two types of questions we can ask about life history patterns or strategies. First, how is the habitat or environment selected one strategy over another? Those would be external forces. And the second, why or how does one component of an organism's life history affect other components? Do different components place restrictions on each other? So, for example, you can't give birth to large offspring unless you are large yourself. You can't allocate energy to survival or foraging or growth that you have already allocated to reproduction. So, you have to be an integrated whole. And how do you achieve that integration? How can we find some logic? Well, we can start by breaking down the life history into components. So, we have, for example, size. Should individuals be large or small? What's the optimal size? What determines the optimal size? How big should the offspring be when they hatch or are born? And then we have growth and development. Should embryos grow and develop rapidly or slowly? How long should the gestation time be? Should adults keep growing throughout their lives, or should they just grow to some final endpoint and stay the same size from then on? Storage. Should an organism store a surplus of food in part of its body? Or should it always metabolize its food immediately? Time of first reproduction. When should the transition from child to adult occur? It can occur physiologically at just about any time in mammals. Why does it happen when it does? Number of clutches. How many times should an individual reproduce over its lifetime, and how long should it wait between reproductions? Size of clutches. Should an individual produce many young and mate a few times, or vice versa? Parental care. How much time and energy should parents invest in rearing of their offspring? Dispersal. How far should an organism disperse from its site of birth? Senescence. How long is the organism capable of living? And the fundamental concept that is used in understanding life history patterns is allocation of energy and resources. So we can ask, how much is allocated to different activities? And we can usually divide activities into their contributions to the two components of fitness. It's most convenient. So those are reproduction and survival. So we have this life history, this life cycle, and we can divide it into those two components. So reproduction can be divided into its components. So, for example, number of offspring versus parental care. And survival can be divided into its components, for example, storage versus growth. And it's easy to imagine an organism with maximum fitness. It reproduces right after birth, produces large clutches of large offspring, lavishes parental care on all its offspring, does this repeatedly throughout its infinitely long life, outcompetes its competitors, always escapes predation, catches prey easily. But of course, this organism doesn't exist because resources are limited. If it allocates all its resources to reproduction, it can't also allocate all its resources to survival, and so on. It has to divide up its resources and allocate some fraction of each of the activities to its life history. So, a fundamental fact of life in any organism is trade-offs. Trade-off is a negative correlation between two life history activities caused by two phenomena, two possibilities that could cause trade-offs. One is limitations in the total resource available to be allocated to them. If you allocate to one, then you can't allocate that same amount to the other because there's limitations to how much resource there is. And the second phenomenon is engineering constraints. For example, it's hard to be a clam that flies. If you're a bird, hard to fly in the air and underwater. Hard to be an efficient swimmer and an efficient runner both. So resource limitations and engineering constraints. So as a result, if you increase your total fitness by increasing one activity, that usually results in a decrease in fitness through a reduction of some other activity. So trade-offs are a fact of life that cannot be gotten rid of. So we can think of fitness as the total reproductive success of an individual. And this time we're talking about Darwinian fitness, not inclusive fitness, since we're not looking at interactions among kin right now. And total reproductive success has two components: present reproduction and future reproduction. It takes energy to reproduce. Females produce eggs, nurse and care for their young. Males fight, court, sometimes also care for their young. This means there's a trade-off between present reproduction and future reproduction. If you allocate energy to present reproduction, you can't also allocate that energy to future reproduction. There's only a limited amount of resources to allocate. So this creates a trade-off between present and future reproduction. This trade-off is called the cost of reproduction. The cost of reproduction permeates the evolution of life and the life history pattern. Understanding how the cost of reproduction works allows us to understand, for the most part, why an organism has a life history pattern that it does. So we can represent trade-offs by this negative relationship between two components, represented by this red line. So the major life history trade-offs are, number one, the cost of reproduction. And present reproduction reduces future reproduction. So if the total energy and resources available is limited or finite, then we can say it's used either for reproduction now or maintenance now. Maintenance meaning everything needed to survive to reproduce in the future. So the total resource is reproduction plus maintenance. So present reproduction reduces future reproduction because it reduces storage, it reduces growth, it reduces survivorship, and it reduces maintenance. Any energy allocated to reproduction usually is not allocated to growth and survival. So an increase in reproductive output usually results in a decrease in growth and survival. So the cost of reproduction basically is everywhere. Lots of terrestrial examples: trees, the fruit fly, Drosophila. Also neutered and spayed domestic cats and dogs live longer than unaltered animals. Sockeye salmon, there's a positive relationship between body mass of females and eggs. Bigger fish produce more eggs, indicating it requires resources to produce eggs. Those resources are the cost. The snail Buccinum undatum, the gonad index, is the percent of total mass, that is gonads. And it shows that, again, it takes up mass, which is energy, and resources. Females here have a higher mass of gonads than males. This is the ovary. This is the testis here. The two crab females, Cancer pagurus and Maya squinato, females hold eggs, and Maya aerates them, which takes energy measured as oxygen uptake. They flap their abdomen and move their chelate to move water across the eggs. The cancer species apparently does not put much energy into brooding, according to this graph, while Maya does, as indicated by oxygen uptake. And that oxygen uptake is a cost. There's one of the costs that Maya has to pay for reproduction. The shad, genus Alosa, same thing. More eggs they produce, the lower their survivorship, therefore fewer return to spawn the next year. In the glaucous-winged gull, also, more chicks are fledged, the lower the adult survivorship. It takes energy to feed chicks, which is costly and is paid in higher mortality. Higher mortality as a result of reproduction. That is the cost of reproduction. Many other examples. Second major life history trade-off is the number of offspring versus the size and fitness. Usually fitness is positively related to size of the offspring. So for example, the crustacean Euterpina, the larger the egg size, the fewer the eggs per sac. Negative relationship. If there's a constant limit in resources, then the larger the egg, the smaller the number of eggs, so that the total energy expended amounts to the same. And if you look at all North American fish species, for example, and the same, I'm sure, applies to fish species in other continents, across species, collecting them, all the species together, each point here is a different species. The higher the egg diameter, the smaller the clutch size limit. So there's a convex relationship here, which indicates a trade-off at the extremes, at least, of high diameter or clutch size. The black circles here are marine species, and the open circles are freshwater species. Also, there are engineering trade-offs that we haven't really considered, and there are many examples of that, in which the laws of physics make it difficult often to do several types of things equally well. Classic example, marine example, are barnacles, which use their legs to filter out food in the water column. Obviously, if you're using your legs to filter out food, then it might be difficult to use your legs for other functions while you're filtering out the food, like, for example, locomotion. And in barnacles, they go to the extreme of not moving at all. They glue their heads to the rock surface, and their legs are used only for selectively filtering food out of the water column. Okay, so let's turn to our basic questions this week. Are there patterns that link particular life histories to particular types of habitats or particular types of organisms? How do we explain a typical life history allocation pattern as a result of natural selection? And as a conceptual framework, we're going to develop a graphical theory of life history, ecology, and evolution. This graphical theory allows us to easily visualize what's going on. And this theory has two components. The first is the trade-off option set. Since the cost of reproduction is the most important trade-off in life history evolution, we'll be looking at the cost of reproduction option set. That's present reproduction versus future reproduction. So the option set is simply the total set of options, life history options, in terms of body, physiology, behavior, and everything, that an organism has for its two life history components. Because we're looking at the cost of reproduction, we plot the option set of present reproduction versus present growth, which is future reproduction. Okay, so this pink area represents all of the possible combinations of present and future reproduction that some hypothetical organism is capable of. Okay, and there's important thing to notice here is there's a boundary which has a negative slope. So what does this boundary represent? This is the trade-off between present and future reproduction. If an individual reproduces more now, its maximum possible future reproduction is less because it only has limited resources to devote to either one. An individual could have this point here representing this present and future reproduction, but it cannot go above this trade-off boundary. So if you have this present reproduction, then you can have this future reproduction. If you have a greater present reproduction, then the maximum future reproduction is going to be smaller. And this point right here is out of the option set. It's not within this region here, and therefore it's not possible. It's just not possible within the body plan of the organism. It's not one of the options that's available to the organism. So this is a linear boundary, straight line. This is a convex boundary. Why should the option set boundary be convex in most species? Well, there are two reasons. First, because the resources that are limiting reproduction are often a little bit different from those that limit growth. So allocating more to reproduction doesn't have a large effect on growth until you start allocating your maximal amounts to reproduction. That's over here. So down here, there's not much of an effect. And then until you get down here when there's a large effect. Also, the two functions might actually overlap to some extent. For example, in plants, to reproduce, you also have to grow. So the two contribute to each other, and as a result, there might not be a large negative slope here at first. But again, with a large allocation to present reproduction, you start to have a large effect on future reproduction. So two reasons why we might have a convex boundary. The second component of this theory is the fitness contour. This is simply a line or a curve, but we'll just assume for simplicity that's a line that joins values of present growth or present reproduction and future reproduction for which the total fitness is constant. So every point on this line has the same total fitness. So in this case, because we have a straight line, the total fitness is just the sum of x and y components, present and future reproduction. All right, so why do we have this particular line? Well, we just assume that this is a property of the habitat. The habitat gives us this fitness contour. And the habitat is telling the organism all points on this line have the same fitness. Okay, now imagine you can move this line without changing its slope. Well, if you move the line, that means the sum of the x and y components gets greater and greater and greater, which means the total fitness gets higher and higher and higher. So moving the line from a position close to the origin to a position away from the origin means you're increasing fitness. And we're assuming that the line always is going to have the same slope. So how do we put together fitness contours and option sets onto one graph? Well, here they are. So how do we interpret this? It's very simple. The option that an organism should choose is the option of the set of options of present and future reproduction that maximize its fitness. So that's simply the line here on the fitness contour that touches the fitness. So how do we put together fitness contours and option sets? Well, this is how we do it. It's very simple. Here's the option set, and here's the fitness contour for this particular habitat. So as we go farther and farther out, we have lines that are higher and higher fitness. So an organism could choose any point right in here within this option set. But which is the point that maximizes its fitness? Well, that's the point on the line that's farthest from the origin. So that would be right here. So this is the point where the organism would maximize its fitness, right here. So you look at the option set and the line that is tangent with the option set, and that point where it's tangent, the fitness contour is tangent, that's the maximum fitness in theory that it's possible for the organism to have. So if it was behaving in a way that maximizes its fitness, it would devote this amount to present reproduction here, and this amount to future reproduction here. So if we take that fitness contour and put it at the tangent point to the option set, it's a tangent right at that point here, which would be the optimum life history strategy. So this is the optimum life history strategy to devote this amount to present and this amount to future reproduction, because that's the strategy that maximizes fitness. So if the organism was capable of strategies out here on this line, it would have a higher fitness, but it's not by definition because this is its option set. On the other hand, the organism is capable of allocations along these fitness contours that are closer to the origin, but those allocations have a lower fitness. So we have the option set, which represents the organism, and the fitness contour, which represents the environment, or more precisely, the interaction between the organism and the environment. So these can be used together to predict the optimal allocation of different types of organisms, represented by the option set, in different types of environments, which is represented by the slope of the fitness contour. So we're going to talk about different types of environments, all right? And this is the classification of habitats. So we're going to start by classifying habitats, but before I do this, I want to make the disclaimer that a habitat is experienced differently by different organisms. So any classification makes sense only from the point of view of the organisms themselves. Habitat basically is in the eye of the beholder. So just keep in mind that any particular classification will apply only to some organisms in that habitat, and different classifications will be necessary for different groups of organisms. And we classify habitats along two dimensions, and these two dimensions represent the two fundamental life history trade-offs. First is the trade-off between present and future reproduction, the cost of reproduction. And the second is the trade-off between number and size of offspring, the cost of numerous offspring. But first we'll look at the cost of reproduction, and in this case we have high cost of reproduction habitats and low cost of reproduction habitats, or high CR habitats and low CR habitats. And how do we represent this difference using the fitness contour line? Well, high CR habitats, so high cost of reproduction habitats, have a nearly horizontal contour. High cost of reproduction means that if you increase your current reproduction, it has a large negative effect on your future reproduction. Therefore, your total fitness should not increase very rapidly. That future component is decreasing at the same time. This is exactly what happens with a near horizontal fitness contour. As current reproduction increases, the contour doesn't move much from the origin. So it doesn't increase in fitness much. So think of it this way. Here, I'm going from this point of present reproduction to this point, which is a large difference. Okay, and look how much the fitness difference increases if I invest a lot in present reproduction. It goes from here up to here. So the future reproduction does not increase very much. So maybe your environment is limiting how much of an effect present reproduction has on your future. There's some factor in the environment that's limiting how much this increase affects the future reproduction. So if there is a limit making the line, the fitness contour nearly horizontal, then that represents high cost of reproduction. Low cost of reproduction habitats have a nearly vertical fitness contour. So in this case, we have the reverse situation. If cost of reproduction is low, that means that current reproduction has little negative effect on future reproduction. So there's no subtracting of future reproduction as you increase the present, so your total fitness increases faster. There's nothing in the environment that limits the effect of present reproduction on future reproduction. So if you increase your present reproduction, then that increases greatly your future reproduction. So in this case, you have a low cost of reproduction situation or habitat. So why should a habitat have a low cost of reproduction? Well, for example, if size doesn't matter much in terms of fitness. In ponds that dry out in summer, for instance, all aquatic individuals die regardless of size. So reproducing a lot and not growing doesn't have much consequences for future reproduction. So if mortality is the same regardless of size, the habitat has a low cost of reproduction. The habitat, on the other hand, may be so benign that all individuals will survive regardless of how much they reproduce. For example, a newly opened habitat. Or, for example, predators prefer larger prey. So reproducing now might reduce your growth rate and keep you safe from predators in the future. Low cost of reproduction. Why should a habitat have a high cost of reproduction? Well, for example, if individuals have to be large to compete with each other, reproducing now has a high cost because it prevents you from growing large and competing and reproducing in the future. Predators prefer small individuals, for example. And then if you reproduce now, you will stay small longer and be less likely to be reproducing in the future. So in low cost of reproduction habitats, delaying reproduction is punished for these various reasons. And in low cost of reproduction habitats, we expect organisms to evolve so that they have a fast life cycle, fast growth, early maturity, short gestation period, and fecundity and reproductive allocation is high, small body, short longevity. In high cost of reproduction habitats, the habitat, for example, might improve over time, more resources and conditions. Predators prefer smaller prey, and individuals might improve over time. Older individuals become better competitors, and better able to escape from predation. So that would be a high cost of reproduction situation. So evolution in high CR habitats, we expect the reverse of the low CR evolution. Slow life cycle, lower fecundity, larger body, longer lifespan. So if you use this graphical theory to apply the idea, what prediction do we get? In a high cost of reproduction habitat, what should be the reproductive allocation? Well, there should be a low allocation to reproduction. That's because the fitness contour touches the option set right here at this point, which is a low present reproduction and a higher future reproduction. In a low cost of reproduction habitat, we have the reverse. The fitness contour line intersects the option set right here, where you have a high present reproduction and a lower future reproduction. That's a low cost of reproduction habitat or situation. Very simple and straightforward. Are these predictions borne out in nature? Well, we have several marine examples. People have applied this theory. For example, freshwater mosquito fish versus brackish water mosquito fish. If it takes a lot of energy to stay alive, individuals may have little disposable energy any particular breeding season, and so have little energy to allocate to reproduction. This represents a high cost of reproduction situation. In mosquito fish that expend a lot of energy osmoregulating in freshwater, reproductive allocation is low. In those that don't need to osmoregulate much, and like for example in brackish water, reproductive allocation is higher. At least that's the prediction and interpretation that Steve Stearns proposed here in this paper. And Steve Stearns is a major figure in life history theory, life history, ecology, and evolution. He wrote a few books, several papers on the subject. He was the ecology professor when I was a student. In tapeworms and other parasites, internal parasites, reproductive allocation can be enormous. This is presumably because the environment is so benign, living inside another organism. You lie bathed in nutrients all the time. And so individuals survive no matter how much they reproduce. So this represents basically zero cost of reproduction. Another prediction we can make using the concept of cost of reproduction is age or size at first reproduction or time to maturity. So in a high cost of reproduction environment, individuals should allocate relatively little resource to reproduction. One way of doing this is to delay maturity to later in life when the organism is larger. So delayed maturity represents a reproductive allocation of zero at a particular time. You're going to delay it. And in a low cost of reproduction habitat, one should see the reverse. As cost of reproduction is low, it pays to reproduce as early as possible. And these predictions have been confirmed in a study of guppies in Trinidad, Bosilia reticulata. Guppies live in small streams of two kinds. Those whose main predator is a cichlid fish, Chronicula alta, which prefers large sexually mature guppies, and those whose main predator is a killifish, Rivulus hardii, which prefers small juvenile guppies. So the cichlid stream is a low cost of reproductive habitat, and the killifish stream is a high cost of reproduction habitat. And age of first reproduction is exactly as predicted in the cichlid stream. the guppies reproduced earlier and a smaller size. In the killifish stream, the guppies reproduced later and larger. And what's interesting here, even more interesting, is if the cichlid guppies were transplanted to a killifish stream after about 11 years, they no longer matured early and small. Their age and size at maturity was about the same as the native guppies in the killifish stream. And this difference constituted evolution because the difference persisted in the laboratory and so undoubtedly had a genetic basis. So this work by Resnick is summarized in this table. All of these life history traits here and differences between the two populations here. Simple t-test here with the probability values of the t-tests reported. These patterns are also seen in studies of sex dimorphism in age at first reproduction. So in polygynous species, males often fight for access to mates, as we saw in the elephant seal example. So large males tend to have a higher reproductive success than smaller males. And so they gain from deferring mating until they are a larger size. So this represents a high cost of reproduction situation early in life. And as predicted in these species, maturity in males occurs later than maturity in females. So intrasexual selection, in this case, affects evolution of the life history, age at first reproduction. In contrast, in promiscuous species, especially those with external fertilization, so the gametes are released into the water and fuse at random or nearly at random, there isn't any such competition among males at all, so no need to defer maturity. However, the bigger females can release more eggs, so for females it may pay to defer reproduction to later in life. So as predicted in these species, for example, fish in general and many insects and crustaceans and invertebrates, maturity in females occurs later than maturity in males. And so again, the predictions from the model are confirmed. Fish species in general show predictable patterns among them relating to the cost of reproduction. So the higher the adult mortality rate, the earlier the fish matures. Also, the optimal reproductive effort is the effort that approximately equals the adult mortality rate. So Lester and colleagues show that as adult mortality increases in freshwater fishes, the total fecundity also increases. And then the time to maturity decreases. The higher the mortality rate, the lower the cost of reproduction. If you're going to die anyway, the cost of reproducing is going to be small, and you should invest a large amount into reproduction. If your chances of surviving are high, then the cost of reproduction is higher, and you're better off investing less in reproduction. In general, fish invest just enough to balance their mortality rates. And Juan Iorda et al., this paper, tunas and related species, there's a positive relationship between maximum length of the fish and lifespan, longevity. This is consistent with Lester's predictions. The lower your mortality, the less you invest in reproduction, and the more resource you have to invest in growth. Low cost of reproduction associated with smaller size, shorter lifespan. Over here. If you have a short lifespan, it's less costly to reproduce, lower cost of reproduction. Similar relationship is shown between longevity, corrected by size, and also growth rate within fish of any size. So if your chances of survival are low, then you grow fast to maturity. so that you can reproduce before dying. This is low cost of reproduction. If you're not likely to survive, then grow fast so that you can reproduce before dying. In this Adams 1980 paper, a large number of fish species in different groups show relationships really well. There is a positive relationship between cost of reproduction and body size, maximum age, and age at first maturity. So, and a negative relationship between cost of reproduction and natural mortality and growth rate. These relationships were shown empirically for a lot of species. So these are positive relationships here, and then negative relationships here. So this is body size, maximum age, age at first maturity, natural mortality, and growth rate. So these relationships were shown empirically. Those are the predicted, and they were actually shown empirically in several groups. For example, here we got salmon. We've got cods. Same signs, positive and negatives, as predicted by the cost of reproduction theory. Herring and anchovies, positive, negative. Flatfishes, positive here, negative here. And rockfishes, or the scorpionfish. This paper by Weinmiller and Rose, we have in North America marine fishes basically two dimensions of life histories, a cost of reproduction axis, it's a horizontal one, and then the investment, energy investment per offspring, which is a vertical. So a low cost of reproduction is correlated with lower investment per offspring, smaller size, smaller clutches, more spawning bouts. Each group of fish falls somewhere on this 2D plot in these dimensions. So this is a nice ordination figure of life history strategies in all the major groups of North American marine fishes. Fish life histories evolve in response to overfishing. Cooper and colleagues' paper here. Overfishing represents a low cost of reproduction. If you're going to be harvested anyway, then reproduction is suddenly cheap. So it's caused cod to evolve to mature earlier and at a smaller size, as you can see from these graphs. Growth, age at maturity. Broad life history relationships in marine invertebrates. Allen and Pernay, 2007 paper. Low cost of reproduction. We have planktotrophy, or larvae that feed in the water column. Low investment per larva. If the survival rate is low, then it makes sense to produce a lot of small larvae to spread out the risk. On the other hand, high cost of reproduction situation, lessitotrophy, or larvae that don't feed in the water column, they feed on their egg yolk. High investment per larva, large egg with large yolk for each larva. You can make high quality offspring because their chances of surviving are higher. So this is the number of species. Most species are in one extreme towards one extreme or the other. Very few that are in between. We can also show a continuum of larval development from low cost of reproduction to high cost of reproduction. As the cost of reproduction increases, we go from free spawning to mating, higher investment in offspring by choosing your mating partner to be of high quality. We also go from planktotrophic to lacithotrophic, to brooding or encapsulation of embryos hatching out as juveniles. Again, higher investment in each offspring. All right, here we have compound microscope shots of free spawn larvae of polychaetes and brittle stars on the low end of the cost of reproduction spectrum, and crab larvae on the high end, where in most species we see mating and brooding or encapsulation of embryos. High cost of reproduction. About 70% of marine invertebrates are free spawning, for example, corals, and the other 30% have some degree of control over mating, for example, crabs and squid. And here's a nice diagram of larval morphology in different groups from the low cost of reproduction end of the spectrum up to the higher cost here. Copepods, barnacles, more complex crustaceans, lobsters, shrimps, and crabs. Check out the coral video that I posted as case in point for a low cost of reproduction life cycle and compare it to the squid video, higher cost of reproduction life cycle. Marine algae life cycles. Algae have alternating haploid and diploid generation life cycles, and sometimes the haploid are indistinguishable from the diploid. In the case of laminaria, the haploid is microscopic. Generally, low cost of reproduction in algae is associated with fast growth to filamentous or sheets that die after a year or two with little or no investment in any kind of grazing resistance. There's plenty of snails that will graze these algae, and low cost of reproduction species do not invest in chemical resistance to those grazers. High cost of reproduction algae is usually associated with lower growth erect macroalgae such as canopy or understory kelps, which are brown algae that live several years with high investment in grazing resistance. All right, we can also make predictions about life history evolution in response to the productivity of the habitat or how much resource it produces. Generally, living material, growth and reproduction. So in a high productivity habitat, we might have this fitness option set, whereas in a low productivity habitat, an organism might have an option set contained within the one for the high productivity habitat. So this is because there's less resource if productivity is low, which reduces the total allocation to both reproduction and future reproduction, present reproduction and future reproduction, which is basically synonymous with growth and maintenance. Okay, so high productivity represents a benign habitat, as in, for example, the habitat experienced by an internal parasite, simply surrounded by resource, an endless supply of resource. And this is a low cost of reproduction situation. So for any given fitness contour, this line here, the total optimal allocation to both present and future reproduction should be greater in the benign, higher productivity habitat than in the less productive habitat. So an early reproductive maturity will be favored, at which time individuals will be relatively large because of their faster rate of growth. And in the less benign, lower productivity habitat, allocation to both growth and reproduction is lower. So individuals should mature later and be somewhat smaller than in the high productivity environment. And these predictions are confirmed in several studies. In our species, Homo sapiens, a similar phenomenon has occurred in the last 100 years. So the quality of nourishment has increased enormously in developed countries over the last century. So For example, in the US, the age at maturity in females has fallen a grand total of about 4 years, and weight at maturity has increased by about 2 kilograms since the turn of the century. Okay, so these kinds of differences in high versus low productivity environments, differences in life history, can be genetic or they can be non genetic. And examples of phenotypic plasticity. Phenotypic plasticity is just flexibility in appearance, size, shape, morphology, physiology. So, in other words, the ability of individuals to modify their phenotype in response to the environment. So, the ability to optimize your phenotype under different conditions. That means that the life history of an individual is often not fixed, but is flexible. And that flexibility or phenotypic plasticity itself can evolve. So we got high cost of reproduction habitats. We have low reproductive allocation, late maturity, larger at maturity, and the reverse in low cost of reproduction habitats. So as a general rule, late age at first reproduction is expected in high CR habitats. High cost of reproduction occurs when older or bigger individuals have a higher fitness, when they have higher survivorship, and hence longer average lifespan. And this can happen for a variety of reasons. And this sort of correlation has been found in all major groups of animals. So we can plot cost of reproduction from low to high on the x-axis and age at maturity on the y-axis. And we can relabel the x-axis because we know the cost of reproduction is positively associated with adult survivorship, which is positively associated with total lifespan. So we can replace the x-axis with total lifespan and say we expect a positive relationship between average or total lifespan and age at maturity for any species. And this is what we do see. For example, birds, the ratio of age at maturity to average lifespan is around 0.37. For mammals, it's around 0.77, 1.4 lizards and snakes, and about 2.2 in fish and shrimp. So this relationship seems to hold very nicely across all the major groups of animals. Positive relationship between average lifespan and age at reproductive maturity, as you would predict from the simple option set fitness contour theory. However, there's some things that we haven't been able to explain yet, and that is these differences in the ratio in different groups. And so, active area of research. So as cost of reproduction increases, these yellow items should increase, and reproductive allocation should decrease as a general rule, according to theory, and that seems to be what we observe in species that are well studied. Right, another aspect, another component of life history is the question, how often should an individual reproduce? Should they reproduce once and then die? Multiple times? If an individual reproduces once and dies, then what should the age of maturity be? And what determines all of the above? Okay, so we'll look at these questions here next. So an annual is a plant or animal that reproduces its first mating season and then dies. A perennial, also called Iteroparous species, survives to reproduce multiple times. So what habitats should favor an annual versus perennial life history? Well, a very low cost of reproduction favors an annual life history. Um, Example of an annual is a nudibranch. Nudibranchs are all annual species, whereas prosobranchs are idoparis. So what habitats should favor an annual versus perennial life history? Well, a very low cost of reproduction favors an annual life history. If the fitness contour is vertical, then the organism maximizes its fitness by allocating 100% of its resources to present reproduction and none to growth. So a very low cost of reproduction occurs if older or bigger individuals have a very low fitness. So if adult survivorship or fecundity is low, the annual life history is favored. So if you're unlikely to survive a second season anyway, then it makes no sense to hold off on reproduction. It makes more sense to put everything you have into reproduction now, since you won't survive in the future to reproduce again. So an annual life history evolves because dying after reproducing is actually has a higher fitness. You'll leave more offspring. Your contribution to the next generation will be higher if you put everything into reproduction now and then die than if you save some resources for next year, because there won't be another next year. So in annual species, we predict that they should have a low survivorship beyond 1 year, basically zero beyond 1 year, such as, for example, you might expect in nudibranchs, which have no shells to protect them from any kind of physical injury or predation by predators. They rely on chemical toxins. Whereas prosobranchs, which have shells, have a higher survivorship for multiple years. And so it makes sense that they would evolve to be perennials, whereas the nudibranchs would evolve to be annuals. And in general, on the seashore, where rocks are small and easily moved by waves, rocks rub against each other and abrasion scrapes off settling organisms and creates very low survivorship. For example, algae. So this is a low cost of reproduction situation, and individuals tend to be small, reproduce quickly, and don't invest a large amount in each offspring. Similarity. This is similar to the annual life history in that individuals usually die after reproducing, but it differs from the annual life history in that, by definition, Sammelparis individuals survive many breeding seasons before they reproduce. But again, after they reproduce, they die. Sammelparity seems to be a paradox since it combines two contradictory attributes. Individuals wait to reproduce, which is a characteristic of high cost of reproductive habitats. But once they reproduce, they allocate all their resources to reproduction. So high reproductive allocation is a characteristic of individuals of low cost of reproduction habitats. How can both occur in the same habitat? The way out of the paradox is to recognize that the fitness contour can change over time. It can change because the habitat changes, or the relationship between the organism and habitat changes as they get older and the organism grows. As the organism increases in size or age, cost of reproduction gradually decreases. This is because the older an organism is, the less likely it is to survive in the future. Also, the bigger it is, the more reproductively successful it might be. So you go from a high cost of reproduction at the beginning of a life to a low cost of reproduction later on. And the classic example of semal is in salmon, which expend enormous energy migrating upstream to their place of birth at a programmed age, usually 3 or 4 years, where they allocate all of their remaining reserves to reproduction and then die immediately afterwards. So up until now, we have been assuming the option set is convex. Now we relax that assumption, and for salmon, we draw a concave option set, represented by this red line. And ignore this pink space here. Imagine this is not here. So this is just the option set here from the red line down to the axes. Okay, so we have a concave option set. Why is the option set concave for salmon? Well, because before reproducing at all, salmon must expend enormous energy migrating to their place of birth. And it could be quite a distance. So if they allocate any resource to reproduction, first they have to allocate a very large amount just to reach their spawning grounds. And once they reach their spawning grounds, it doesn't make much difference anymore. Any additional allocation has little effect on any kind of future growth. So we can imagine the salmon starts out with a near horizontal fitness contour and a high cost of reproduction. It's because they're very small and bigger individuals have higher reproductive success. So their optimal strategy is to put all their resources into growth right up here. But as they get older, the advantage of delaying reproduction gets smaller and smaller. This is because they get bigger, which means they can reproduce more successfully. Eventually, the fitness contour now becomes so close to vertical that their optimal strategy is now to stop growing and begin their spawning migration. This means big bang reproduction. All the resources go into reproduction, meaning that death necessarily follows. So everything is into reproduction right here. So this is the optimal strategy to pass on the most number of genes into the next generation. So with a concave option set, there are only two strategies: putting all your resources into growth or future reproduction, or all into reproduction now. Strategy one, growing, putting off reproduction, is always favored initially, but eventually the fitness contour shifts as the organism grows, and inevitably the optimal strategy is to devote all your efforts to reproduction. And another way to put this, even more simply to understand semal parity, is that semal parity evolves whenever it's extremely unlikely that you will be able to reproduce more than once. In salmon that migrate upstream, mortality rate is quite high, and fish have lost all their energy stores by the time they reach spawning grounds. So the probability of being able to reproduce a second time is nil. It's basically zero. It's not going to happen. And so Crespi and Teo discussed this in this paper, really nice paper in Evolution. So under these conditions, we predict that it makes no sense to invest in future reproduction. So selection should favor individuals who allocate all resources into the present reproduction and then die. Even though they die, they will contribute most to the next generation. Individuals that don't put everything into reproduction will leave fewer offspring because those resources that they have saved will be completely wasted, because they're likely to die before they can put those resources to any use. Right, so there are semilpara species of salmon, and there are also iteropara species of salmon. Semilpara species have a much higher egg weight than the iteroparas. It's because they put all their resources into reproduction and then die. But the iteropara species put less than all of their reproduction. They save some so they can live to reproduce again, because they can reproduce again. If you can't reproduce twice, then it makes sense to put everything into your reproduction whenever you do. Whenever that happens to be, put everything into it because it makes no sense to save it for later because there won't be a later. Okay, the next component of life history is senescence. That just is getting old and run down and eventually dying. So the integration of senescence into an organism's life history can be easily understood in terms of the cost of reproduction trade-off. Why does senescence exist? Why don't organisms live forever? Well, first of all, senescence may in part be the accumulation of molecular defects that fail to be repaired, just as a car eventually wears down and has to be junked. For example, glucose, the sugar glucose, can cross-link to proteins on a cell's surface and inactivate them. High blood glucose correlates with more rapid senescence in humans and mice. People with diabetes, high blood glucose senesce more rapidly. Oxygen can form free radicals and react with virtually anything in the cell, inactivating and destroying proteins and other macromolecules and causing mutations in DNA, which reduces the function of cells. However, none of this can be the full story. If simple wear and tear were the only cause of aging, then we would expect species of similar size and physiology to have the same or close to the same longevity. In other words, similar individuals should wear out at roughly the same rate, but it's not true. Bats, for instance, can live 10 to 20 years, while mice of similar size rarely reach 3 to 5 years. So some species have evolved mechanisms to slow down their rate of aging. Enzymes exist that can break the glucose cross-links, prevent free radicals from reacting with important cellular components. For example, peroxidase enzymes, catalase, superoxide dismutase can scavenge free radicals and prevent oxidation. Also, enzymes can repair breaks in DNA and other kinds of mutations. Others lack those mechanisms. So why should some species lack mechanisms to slow down aging, even though it's physiologically possible to live longer? How can we explain this as an outcome of natural selection? The answer is that mechanisms to slow down aging are costly. Enzymes to repair damage would have to be produced and be active continuously in every cell. This certainly is costly in both energy and materials. Therefore, if the mortality rate of adults is already high in both young and old, for example, if they're preyed on, whether they're young or whether they're old, it makes no sense for an organism to invest in those anti-aging mechanisms since they will never be used anyway. They'll just get hit by predators first. Or maybe accidents, injuries in a high energy environment. So the organism is then better off investing in present reproduction, at least better off in terms of passing its genes on to the next generation, than building anti-aging systems for adults that don't survive long enough to use them anyway. So we can put this in the context of option sets and fitness contours. And the prediction is in low cost of reproduction situations, future fitness is low, so organisms should invest in the present and allocate to present reproduction. So they should have no anti-aging mechanisms or low allocation of these mechanisms and should not survive long even under the best conditions. This is exemplified by mice, which suffer a high rate of mortality from predation and so reproduce fast and often, and they age rapidly, only live for 3-5 years. as anybody who's had a mouse as a pet knows. In high cost of reproduction situations, there are external factors like predation, but these are not a risk, so the baseline mortality rate is low and potential adult survivorship is high. So as a result, it pays to invest in the future and in expensive anti-aging mechanisms in terms of passing your genes on to the next generation. So this is exemplified by many bats, which suffer a low rate of predation and have lower reproductive allocation and live longer. So you'd expect them to invest more in anti-aging mechanisms. So these predictions are beautifully confirmed empirically by Robert Rickliff's data showing a strong positive correlation between baseline mortality rate. This is the minimum rate of mortality, even in the absence of senescence, and the rate of senescence in birds and mammals. So the x-axis here represents a higher cost of reproduction as you go from left to right. As baseline mortality increases, cost of reproduction decreases, and investment in future reproduction loses out over investment in present. So species become locked in a situation of early death, even when external causes of death are eliminated in captivity, leaving only rapid senescence. So we can replace this cost of reproduction axis with an accidental or baseline mortality axis, high on this end and low on this end. And anti-aging mechanisms, we can replace this with rate of senescence, high on the lower end and low on the upper end. And then we can switch them around and still have the same positive relationship here. And the prediction is that baseline mortality should be positively correlated with the rate of senescence in species. And they are in mammals and birds. For example, as the accidental or baseline mortality increases, you get species that have a higher rate of senescence. For example, phalarope, small birds, and small marine mammals like the harbor seal, both of which have a high rate of predation. Harbor seal gets hit by killer whales and sharks, and so they don't have chances of living very long anyway. And so it doesn't pay to invest in anti-aging mechanisms, and so the rate of senescence is higher. Whereas if you have a low accidental or baseline mortality, such as in large marine mammals, like the blue whale, and large birds, like the albatross, the rate of senescence is quite low. They live to be over 50 years. I think the oldest albatross is something like 52 years. May have been an older one found since then. Okay, so if you plot mammals and birds along this graph, you'll find this nice, highly significant positive relationship between just accidental or baseline mortality in the environment, causing low lifespan regardless of anti-aging mechanisms, and the rate of senescence. So these species you take into the lab and protect them from accidental baseline mortality, they still won't live for very long because they senesce more rapidly. These species, on the other hand, they will live a long time. They do not senesce as rapidly. They've invested in anti-aging mechanisms. So we can apply this to Homo sapiens, the human species. Basically, we live long because we have big brains and we're smart. We're smart enough to keep our baseline mortality rate close to zero. So adults have a high potential survivorship, and so it pays to invest in the future. So we're a high cost of reproduction species, which means a slow rate of aging species. We can afford to wait to reproduce many years because our risk of death is small. All right, our last life history component, the size versus number of offspring. And this is the second major life history trade off. That's between the size and the number of offspring. Again, we have this negative relationship at the boundary of the option set. We can conceptualize this in exactly the same way we did with the cost of reproduction trade off. We have the option set, which is now not a trade off between present and future reproduction. Instead, we look at the trade off between size and number of offspring. And so we have two extremes of fitness contours. One represents a habitat in which fitness of offspring is independent of their size, and another in which bigger offspring have a higher fitness. So the first habitat is offspring size insensitive, and the second offspring size sensitive. So in offspring size insensitive habitats, an individual should produce many small offspring. And in offspring size sensitive habitats, an individual should produce few large offspring. So what kind of a habitat might be an offspring size sensitive habitat? Well, for example, if larger offspring have a higher survivorship because they're better able to escape predation, or they're better able to tolerate stressful abiotic conditions such as low salinity or high temperature. So if larger offspring are better able to make it, then you have an offspring size sensitive habitat. An offspring size insensitive habitat would mean that predators don't discriminate based on size. They take equally all size offspring, equally effective in catching all size offspring. Or another type of habitat in which it doesn't matter how big you are, you're still equally susceptible to low salinity or high temperature or other stresses in the environment. So, looking for size sensitivity and insensitivity in corals, Hartman and colleagues found that in one species, larger larvae seem to have a higher tolerance of low salinity and high temperature than small. So this would be an offspring size sensitive species. Whereas this other species of coral didn't seem to show much difference. At least it wasn't, there may have been a difference uh, in ambient conditions and low salinity, but it wasn't significant. Look at the confidence intervals here. And a small offspring seem to survive higher temperatures better than a large, but there was no significant difference. So obviously more research is necessary, maybe with bigger sample sizes, um, to understand these relationships, but at least there is some evidence that large size can confer an advantage in larvae. All right, now we're going to sum up, talk about R versus K and fast versus slow, two very similar continuums in life history evolution. So many of the predictions that we've been making about life history patterns can be summarized with a concept that has been very influential in organizing the diversity of life history patterns. This is basically the concept of R and K selection. And the letters R and K refer to the parameters in the logistic growth equation for a population, which we will look at in the second part of the course on populations. So an R-selected individual maximizes its lifetime fitness by evolving a high reproductive rate. That's a high value of R. And a K-selected individual maximizes its fitness over its lifetime by evolving strategies to survive and reproduce in a population at carrying capacity. And K is the parameter used to symbolize carrying capacity. So a K-selected individual maximizes fitness under crowded competitive conditions. So the RK concept is based on the idea there are two extremes of habitat. There's an R-selecting habitat and a K-selecting habitat. And the life history of an organism evolves to lie somewhere on the continuum from the extreme R-selected to K-selected. And the same continuum is also referred to as the fast-slow life history continuum. This is the more modern designation, since R and K refer to population phenomena that may or may not be important in guiding the evolution of a life history. So we'll talk a little bit more on this later. So the K-selecting habitat is a slow habitat, and the idea here is there's not much environmental variation, not much variation in the external environment causing mortality. So the population is stable, and the population can increase to very dense numbers because it's stable. And as a result, there's intense competition for resources. And because there's intense competition, the bigger you are, the more experienced you are, the better you're able to compete for those scarce resources. That's a K-selecting or slow habitat. The R-selecting or fast habitat, the idea here is there's large variation in the external environment causing variation mortality. So benign conditions usually don't last very long. You're going to get hit by something fairly quickly. They're regular disasters, and therefore populations don't get a chance to grow to large sizes where competition can occur. So competition is generally not very intense, it's relaxed, and there's abundant opportunity for successful reproduction because the environment is wide open most of the time because of these regular disasters. So this is the idea of an R-selecting or fast habitat. So you can look at you can plot the population density n against time. So in a K habitat or a slow habitat, we have a stable, high density population over time, not much variation. But in an R habitat or fast habitat, you have these regular disasters, external disasters, that cause the population to crash. And so it rarely has enough time to reach high density where you have high competitive conditions. So for a K habitat, which is a slow habitat, you have a high cost of reproduction, offspring size sensitive habitat. So K selected individuals should be larger size. They should defer reproduction to later. They should be iteroparous in general, not semiparous, and they should have a long lifespan and lower reproductive allocation every time they reproduce because they're always saving some for the next time for maintenance and survival. And they should have larger and fewer offspring. Whereas in our habitat or fast habitat, this is a low cost of reproduction, offspring size insensitive habitat. Our selected individuals then should have smaller size, reproduce early, be annual or semiparous, short lifespan, and a higher reproductive allocation because they're less likely to hold back for the future. Produce small, numerous offspring rather than a few large offspring. So life history evolution can be treated pretty simply using trade-off theory, the option set and the fitness contour. And this theory makes specific predictions that generally have been empirically confirmed. And at the center of life history evolution is the cost of reproduction and the simple continuum from low to high CR, which is basically the same as the RK continuum and the fast slow continuum. So life history ecology is easy in theory to understand. As long as you know where species lies on this continuum, you understand the most important aspects of its optimal life history. And most species tend to be on one end or the other. They don't tend to be in the middle. So the cost of reproduction increases as the probability of future reproduction increases. And as we've seen in this lecture, there's an abundance of empirical information in support of the theory. For example, the life history parameters of fish that we looked at in the Adams 1980 paper can be interpreted in terms of R and K. You can look at this table 1 here. Our selected fish species, they have a small body size, small maximum age, early maturity, high natural mortality, high growth rate to maturity. K-selected species, large body size, large age and longevity, late maturity, low natural mortality, high growth rate to maturity. So these can be also thought of as fast versus slow life histories. R selected is growing fast to early maturity and dying early. K selected is growing slow to late maturity and dying late. All right, that's the topic for this week. Click on the links below for the lecture videos. I'm linking separately, and have a great rest of your day. See you next time.